G'day YouTubers, Warbles on a lot here. Have you ever wondered when it was that people in the West first began to worry about third world nations using asymmetric warfare against the West? Well, this fella John Wyndham, better known for Day of the Triffids, while writing under the name John Benyon Harris, wrote a story called the Puffball Menace. And he's written it in either 1933 or 1939 or 1934 or 1933. So if we put that in context, the British Royal Air Force started to bomb Iraq in 1919 and bombed Iraq steadily until 1924. When the Iraqis had been bombed into submission, then in 1928 they started to bomb on the northwest frontier of India in a place called these days Pakistan and Afghanistan. So this was what an Englishman was thinking about how the tribal people might react. Okay, it's going to be about a 4-part series because I'm going to read 23 pages of the whole short story to you. Yes, it's a malt liquor video. This is the third one I've had today, and therefore I'm having to restart the shoot. Because when you inject alcohol into movie making, it doesn't always go perfectly smoothly. So, here we have the prologue of the Puffball Menace. Prince Kordar of Gangistan was in a bitter mood. His council, seated cross-legged upon a semicircle of cushions before him, had come to know too well that look of dissatisfaction. Of late it had seemed to dwell perpetually upon his dark features. The members of the council were aware of his words before he spoke, so often had they heard them. To all great nations, he observed, might is right. Today we hear much talk of the rights of small nations, and to what does it amount? Nothing but so much dust in the wind to fill the eyes of those who would see. He glowered upon his councillors. Each appeared occupied in an interested study of the mosaic floor. The beauty of its patterns was more soothing than the expression on the prince's face. More than one grimy forefinger scratched in its owner's beard in order to give a misleading suggestion of thought. The council was formed entirely of old men. Not that old men are always wise, but they do have the advantage of less fiery ambitions, and whether one is a prince in Gangistan or a big shot in Chicago, too much ambition at court will prove embarrassing. The ambitions of most of the council rose a little higher than bountiful supply of food and drink and an occasional change of wives. The prince continued to address unresponsive figures. What can we do? These English and other foreigners trifle with us. They do not so much as stir to consider our demands. We are treated like children. We of Gangistan, whose temples and palaces were weathered when the English hid in caves, whose ancestors reached back unbroken to the creation. We offer them war and they laugh as one laughs at the ferocity of a cornered mouse. Here we must sit, impotent, while they pour over our country the froth and ferment of their way of life, in mockery of the wisdom of our sacred ancestors. Again the prince paused and looked questioningly about him. At the lack of response he shrugged his shoulders. Some of the spirit seemed to go out of him, and he threw out his hands in a token of helplessness. And we can do nothing. We have no big guns, no aeroplanes. We must sit by and watch our ancient race seduced from its gods and hear the voice of wisdom drowned by the sounding emptiness of materialism. He finished dejectedly. His anger had subsided beneath fatalism, and he brooded amid the respectful, if slightly bored silence of the council. One ancient looked up and studied the prince. He allowed a decent interval to elapse before he inquired, "Is it permitted to speak?" The prince regarded him with but little lifting of his despondency. "It is permitted to you, Haramin," he agreed. The old man stroked his beard for some moments in placid reflection. "It has seemed to me," he began with slow deliberateness, that already we are more affected by the Westerners than we acknowledge. Even our methods of thought have become curiously coloured by their mental processes. We begin now to distort our pure wisdom to fit their strange conventions. A murmur of protest ran round the council, but none dare give full voice to his indignation, for the old man was privileged. "Explain the full meaning," commanded the prince. "It is well shown by an example, my prince. See how these Westerners wage war. First they send a declaration to warn their enemies. Is this not absurd?" This was written before Pearl Harbor. "Then they use against that enemy a series of weapons similar to his own, which is plainly ridiculous. They have, in fact, rules for war, a conceit worthy only of children or imbeciles. We, in our wisdom, know better. We know that wars should be won or lost, not childishly prolonged until both sides give up for very weakness and weariness. And yet," he paused and looked round him, "and yet we sit here lamenting our lack of weapons, lamenting that we cannot meet our oppressors on their own ground. It is a foolishness to consider the standards of the West in war." The Prince Cordar frowned. The tone of the other's speech displeased him, but he was aware that some deeper thought had prompted it. He asked coldly, "Is it necessary here, Haramin, to lurk like an old fox in a thicket of words? I have a nephew, Prince, a man of great learning in the ways of the West, yet retaining the wisdom of his ancestors. He has a plan which should interest your Highness." The Prince leaned forward. At last they seemed to be getting somewhere. "Where is this nephew, Haramin?" "I have brought him to await your Highness's summons." The Prince struck a silver gong beside him. To the entering servant he said, "The nephew of Haramin awaits. Let him be brought before us." Chapter 1, The Mysterious Growths. Ralph Waite's father beamed genially across the dinner table. "It's good to have you home again, my boy," he said. "How long do you think you can manage?" Ralph, a lusty, fair-haired young man, turned towards him. "Only the weekend, I'm afraid, Dad." Mrs. Waite looked up with a wrinkle of concern and disappointment. "Is that all, dear? Don't you think that if you wrote nicely to them, they might let you stay a little longer?" Ralph checked the rising smile. "I don't think it would be much good writing nicely to Amalgamated Chemicals, Mother," he said gravely. "I suppose you know best, dear, but—" Mr. Waite broke in with some little excitement. "I have got something to show you after dinner, Ralph. Quite the most remarkable thing in all my gardening experience." His eyes were on his plate, so that he missed the look with which his wife favoured him. "But, dear," she began, "Ralph will want to—" Ralph checked her with a glance. Of course, he wanted to go and see Dorothy. His real desire was to rush off at this very moment, but he knew his father's enthusiasm for his hobby. The old man would be sadly disappointed if he could not impress his son with his latest horticultural triumph. After all, Ralph reflected, the old boy got little enough pleasure pushed away in this little Cornish town for the rest of his life. "What is it?" he asked. Mr. Waite chuckled. "You'll see, my boy, all in good time, all in good time." The town of St. Brian lives not far from the south coast of Cornwall. A swift river, the Bod, flows through it on its way to join the English Channel at a point where it is almost the Atlantic Ocean. To the north one can see those strange dazzling white cones which are the refuse of the clay pits, and from the higher points it is possible to trace the course of the Bod right down to the sea in the south. The houses are mostly built of grey stone, their roofs clamped down upon them lest they should be whirled off by the gales, which in winter sweep in from the Atlantic. In sheltered spots where they are able to take advantage of kindly climate, flowers and plants thrive, as was excellently testified by Mr. Waite's garden. Dinner concluded, he led the way importantly across a stretch of smooth lawn to the thick hedge masking the far corner of his ground. As they reached the gap, he paused, and with something of the manner of a showman waved his son forward. "There, my boy," he said proudly, "just take a look at that." Ralph, as he stepped forward to the hedge, was fully prepared to be impressed, but at the sight which met him, the nicely turned phrases he had thought up for the other's gratification fled away. He stared speechlessly for a moment, then, "What on earth's that?" he demanded. "Ah, I thought it'd surprise you. Fine growth, what?" "But what is the thing?" persisted Ralph, gazing in horrified fascination. "Well," Mr. Waite admitted doubtfully, "I don't think it's been named yet. Sort of an experiment. They got me to try it out. A new form of marrow or something of the sort, I gather. Wait a minute, I'll get the letter." He bustled across the lawn while his son turned to regard the fine growth with renewed interest. Experiment or not, he decided it was quite one of the most unwholesome-looking plants he had ever seen. Roughly spherical, it reminded him mostly of a pumpkin with a diameter every bit of 2 feet. So, yay size? But it was not so much the size which was responsible for his surprise as the colour. It lay before him, clammily glistening in the evening sunlight, a ball of blotchy, virulent yellow. The ground all around was bare, and it lay on one side, attached to the earth only by a poor twisted wisp of a stalk, as foolishly disproportionate as a pig's tail. "It must be a good weight, a thing that size," he muttered to himself. With some distaste, he inserted his hand beneath it, and then stared at the thing in blank surprise. It weighed possibly a pound. It was half a kilo. Pretty light. He was still staring at it when Mr. Waite returned with a paper fluttering in his hand. "Here you are. That and the instructions for growing are all I know about it." Ralph took the typewritten letter. It was headed Slowett and Co., and underneath in a smaller type was added "Agents for Experimental Growers Company." "Dear Sir," he read, "in the course of our experimental work we have succeeded in evolving a new form of vegetable. We have the greatest hopes that this extremely prolific plant will successfully adapt itself to a great range of climatic conditions. Insofar as we've been able to reproduce the various conditions in our laboratories, the results leave nothing to be desired, and we now feel that the time has come to put the plant to the test in the actual climates it will have to face. Our agents, in pursuance of our instructions to find persons likely to be interested in this development, forwarded us your name as that of a consistently successful exhibitor at a number of fruit and vegetable shows, and as one who takes an interest in the scientific side of horticulture. We have, therefore, great pleasure in asking you if you would consider assisting us in the introduction of this new form." Ralph read far enough to enable him to grasp the essentials. "This is all very well, Dad," he remarked, "but what on earth's the good of the thing? It must be hollow. Have you felt its weight?" "Oh, that's all right. It says in the growing instructions which they sent with the seeds that one must not be surprised at the extraordinary lightness. I gather that when it is full grown it begins to solidify or harden. Though it's a queer looking thing, I'll admit, and so were the seeds." He fished in his pocket and found an object which he handed over. "I kept this one out of curiosity. You see, they've enclosed it, or rather several of them, in a kind of capsule. The instructions were emphatic that the capsule must not be opened in any circumstances." "Then how?" "You just bury the whole thing and water it very plentifully. I suppose that dissolves the capsule and lets the thing begin to grow. It certainly shows a fine turn of speed. You'd never guess how long it is since I planted this chap." He stirred the yellow ball with his toe. Ralph did not attempt the guess. "How long?" he inquired. 3 days, said his father with pride. "Only 3 days to reach that size. Of course, I'm not sure how long it'll be before it's any use, but it started very well and—" But Mr. Waite's intended lecture was frustrated. His wife's voice tactfully summoned him to the house. "Don't tell anyone about this yet, my boy. I promised to keep it quiet till the thing should be full grown," he said as he hurried across the lawn. Ralph thankfully departed on his intended visit. Later he was unable to remember whether it was curiosity or absence of mind which caused the one remaining seed capsule to find its way into his pocket. He only knew that it was lucky that he had kept it. Excuse me. Dorothy Forbes had expected Ralph earlier. She had even employed sundry of her waiting moments in inventing such reproaches as might be becoming in a lady slightly neglected. It was a pleasant mental exercise, but little more. Ralph's method of greeting did not allow of the interview being placed on a dignified basis. This means he kissed her. Pre-World War II. Very refined. Instead of venting displeasure, she smoothed her frock, shook back her fair hair, and wondered for a moment why one should blush quite so warmly, and suggested that there was a swing seat in the garden. The swing seat was such a success that it was quite half an hour before an object on the other side of the garden caught Ralph's eye and caused him to sit up, staring. Just visible over the top of a cucumber frame was a curved section of a familiar yellow surface. "Good Lord," he said. "What?" asked Dorothy. Following his line of sight, she added, "Oh, that's one of Daddy's secrets. You're not supposed to see it." "Well, now I have seen it. What about a closer view?" "I suppose it doesn't really matter, but don't tell him you've seen it." A few seconds sufficed to settle any lingering doubts. The plant behind the frame was identical with that in his father's garden, though possibly a few inches smaller. "That's queer," Ralph murmured. Dorothy nodded, though she misapplied the remark. "I think it's horrid. I told Daddy I'm sure it's unhealthy, but he only laughed at me. Somehow I hate the thing. There's such a nasty poisonous look about that yellow." "He's keeping it a secret?" "Yes, he's very jealous about it. He says it will make him famous one day." Ralph nodded. This made it queerer still. He considered for a moment. Two people, each thinking himself unique, were growing this most unprepossessing vegetable. "What about a little walk?" he suggested. Dorothy, with slight surprise at the sudden change of subject, assented. It was a wandering stroll, apparently aimless. Nevertheless, it took them close to a number of back gardens. Altogether, they counted over 20 strange yellow balls. Okay, I would say that's the end of part 1, and we will start chapter 2, The Rash, directly.